Hello, my name is Jessop, and I'm a Research Director at the National Centre for Social Research. Today, I'll be talking about a project looking at public attitudes to linking survey and Twitter data. Before I start, some acknowledgements. This work was funded under an ESRC grant and is part of a larger project I'm working on with Luke, Tarek, and Matt. I'd also like to acknowledge my NatScene colleagues, Mehul, Natasha, Sophie, and Josh, who did a lot of the fieldwork and analysis for this strand. In this presentation, I'm only going to have time to go through some of the surface of the findings. I'll start by giving a bit of background and summarising the methodology we used before talking through our experience chronologically, our initial findings after one round of interviews with the public, and the changes we made as a result of that, and then the initial findings and conclusions after both rounds. So, to get us started, what are we trying to do and why? As with other forms of data linkage, survey data can benefit from additional data covering areas not included in the original questionnaire, perhaps because of their complexity or due to space limitations. At the same time, social media data can benefit from the structure and direction of survey data. For example, we can also begin to analyse how the social media data vary between different groups of interest, such as different age or income groups, assuming that information is collected in the survey. For example, I piloted this approach in the 2017 UK general election. The survey data I had gave me lots of reported information about attitudes to policies, but Twitter data added texture. What were people actually talking about? Who were they talking with? And where were they getting their information? Similarly, by linking the survey data onto the social media data, I could analyse the conversations by whether people voted Labour, Conservative, or not at all. One important part of developing a methodology is considering the ethical implications, an area within which social media data have proved to be destructive. For us, this has meant going back to some basic principles: voluntary participation, which this presentation focuses on, minimising harm and maximising value, and how these best come together. Ensuring voluntary participation when using social media data in social research can be problematic, as researchers are not necessarily in direct contact with the human subject. However, as we are trying to collect the data of survey respondents, we are in fact in contact and therefore in a position to try to collect informed consent. However, this has raised a couple of key challenges. Our previous research has found consent rates to be low, especially in web surveys, potentially introducing bias into the sample and reducing statistical power. We are also asking people to consent to something quite complex. So how informed are the choices that people are making? This project therefore aimed to improve our understanding of public attitudes to linking survey and Twitter data with the goal of improving our approach to collecting informed consent. To do this, we conducted 25 interviews with members of NatSen's research panel. They were purposefully sampled, most notably getting a mixture of people who had previously consented and previously refused consent. We used a mixture of techniques in our interviews, firstly drawing on cognitive interviewing methods, running through our consent questions, asking participants to think aloud as they answer, and probing for understanding. Secondly, a more depth interview to explore people's attitudes. The consent question wording we tested was based on the wording we've used previously on the NatSen panel and also the Understanding Society Innovation panel. It was reviewed by the team with input from colleagues and also NatSen's ethics committee. Broadly, it aimed to cover key pieces of information we needed for informed consent, keep the wording broad to allow for the data to be used for a range of purposes, and keep the information accessible to minimise the risk that people either don't read it or people don't understand it. The first part of the consent question, shown here, is shown up front to all participants who reported having a Twitter account. It aims as simply as possible to cover key points. Firstly, why we're collecting the data, what we're planning to do with the data, what information we will collect, that will hold their data securely, and that they will not be identifiable in anything that's published based on the data. Since this is quite broad, alongside that information, we also provide a number of help links where participants can access more information if they want. I'm not going to go into the details of these as I don't have the time, but you'll be able to see the details of these in the paper referenced at the bottom of this slide. As noted earlier, we split the fieldwork into 2 rounds to allow us to reflect on what was coming up in the interviews and, if necessary, update the design. So what did we find? Firstly, we found a lot of variation in people's preferences and levels of understanding. In general, we found most people had a basic understanding of what we were asking, and people felt confident in their choice, but deeper discussions would identify knowledge gaps, throwing up the odd misconception or piece of missing information. Some people felt there was too much information to absorb, even in the simplified form we were presenting it. Some people used none of the help links, while others read through all of the information. Some read some of them, either looking for specific information or giving up partway through. Another theme that came up in the previous research we have conducted into attitudes to social media research more generally was that people were unsure of how or why the data was of interest to researchers, and therefore why we were asking for it. In addition, they expressed concerns about being misrepresented, that their online persona, what they said in the past, or who they follow might not reflect who they really are. A final theme that came out was that people who didn't focus on or weren't concerned about the areas that we necessarily wanted them to. Perhaps given our ethical framework, one of our focuses on the security of the data and the potential risk that comes with Twitter data making the linked survey data attributable to an individual. However, participants did not focus on this, perhaps partially as a result of being used to trusting such types of data in that sense. We already hold their names, for example, or perhaps partially because of the complexity of understanding the data linkage process. Instead, participants tended to focus on the sharing of their Twitter data in isolation and focused more on privacy than security, expressing concerns about more people and people outside of their expected audience looking at their Twitter content, in particular with regards to things like images of their children. So, following these initial interviews, we decided to make some changes to the consent wording. The first thing we did, in general, was to try and cut any superfluous text as much as possible, focusing on key messages, making it less daunting to read to reduce the risk of people just skimming through. A more substantial change was to give an example of how the data might be used. While still quite general, this aimed to make it clearer why researchers might want to link respondent survey and Twitter data and how the data could be useful. It also aimed to focus people's minds a little more on the fact that they were being asked for consent to link the data and not simply to collect it. Another more substantial change was to move the help links off of the consent question page. Instead, respondents were asked explicitly if they would like more information. If they selected that option, they were then taken through to another page where all of the help links were presented to them. Again, the purpose of this was to reduce the amount of text on the page, so those who were less willing to engage might be more likely to read the key messages, while those who wanted more information still had that opportunity available to them. By moving the help links, for those who did want more information, we felt less constrained in putting too much information on the screen, and we therefore added more help links to this page. These specifically addressed the concerns expressed by participants about the utility of Twitter information and whether or not it represented the real them. It also made the information about how long the information will be collected and stored for more prominent, as this was a common misconception coming up in the interviews and something both respondents and we felt was an important part in the decision. So, what were some of the initial themes coming out of the data after completing all of the interviews and spending a little bit more time analysing the data? Even after the changes we made, we found no participants fully understood what they were consenting to. Most had a basic understanding, but there was still always something they hadn't read, had forgotten, or misunderstood. It seems that because we're asking participants to process a lot of complex information and make a decision relatively quickly, they are therefore taking cognitive shortcuts when making decisions. This is a little worrying and certainly not ideal when looking for informed consent. However, it's worth noting and probably reassuring that, when asked, none of our participants wanted to change their initial answers after having discussed their choice in much more detail. The shortcuts people were making were generally based around 4 themes. Firstly, what were the risks of consenting? This covered things like concern of being misrepresented, feelings of intrusion, having their profiles viewed by people outside of their normal audience, and of their personal data being passed on for commercial purposes. Secondly, what were the benefits of taking part? This generally followed themes along the lines of their reasons for taking part in social research in general, providing better information for researchers, that information being used for the betterment of society and informing policy. Next, do they trust the organisation to hold the data securely and use it for a purpose they approved of? This was a key driver for many consenters, perhaps reflecting that this is an engaged panel sample who were taking part in this research. People tended to be trusting of NatCen and said that they would be of universities, but were more concerned that charities might use it to get money from them, and commercial organisations might not use it for positive purposes. And finally, in particular in the absence of trust, how much control do they have over their data? How long is it held for? Can they control what is accessed, and can they withdraw their consent? These 4 themes mapped onto 3 different types of respondents. The benefits of consenting were present for all, but people were minded to consent focused on their, but people who were minded to consent focused on their trust in NatCen to manage the data responsibly and use it for a purpose they would approve of. They also often didn't view consenting as a high-risk activity for them. In contrast, non-consenters were more likely to focus on the risks, irrespective of how much trust they had. They were unlikely to consent, as not sharing data is their default position. Finally, conditional consenters expressed a willingness to consent if they had sufficient control over the process. Interestingly, we didn't find any clear socio-demographic patterns for these groups in this sample, although it was a small qualitative sample. Participants had different preferences for accessing the information and how it was presented. This depended on how they were making the decisions. A consenter making the choice based on trust may not want to see a lot of information, but conditional consenters who were more interested in what level of control they had might want to see more. But in general, people liked that they could access the information, even if they didn't do so in practice. However, while some people were choosing not to engage, there were also some who were not realizing that the extra information could be accessed, and this is something that we would want to address. So, in conclusion, for now, these initial findings raise some interesting challenges for researchers. Simply presenting information and trying to make it accessible may not be sufficient to ensure fully informed consent. Asking people to process so much information so quickly leads to some of them using heuristic decision-making processes. So what is the ethical researcher's responsibility here? Do we attempt to enforce an informed decision, or is it our responsibility to provide the information but then respect respondents' agency in how they make their choice? And how do we reconcile different respondent preferences in what information is provided and how? We're still discussing these and other issues, but to give some initial thoughts, we want to keep the question as accessible as possible. I think I would rather more people making a decision with a basic understanding than a few people making it with a deep understanding and everybody else disengaging. But the detailed information must still be present for those people who want it and easily accessed. As I said earlier, we had some participants not realizing that there was more information to see, and that's something that we want to address. If we accept that some people will make a decision to consent based on trusting us, then as researchers, it is then our responsibility to repay that trust. And this links back to the initial principles I mentioned at the start. If people are trusting us to process their data responsibly, then we need to make sure our processes minimize the risk of harm to them. And if people are trusting us to use this information in a beneficial way, then we need to make sure we have appropriate justification for collecting and using these data and not just doing it because we can. Thank you very much for your time. I look forward to your questions.